Chapter 5. Politics and Business. Rather than confining my energy, the founding of the Adjustment acted as a stimulus to increase my involvement in a variety of activities. Along with developing the program at the center, I launched my political career, established a private business, and accelerated the pace of my work in various professional and civic organizations. I remember those years as a wonderful and energetic era, even though, ironically, I suffered through the worst disappointments in my life during this same period. Fortunately, time has a way of forcing tragedy into a blurry background while holding life's more joyous moments in sharp focus. As a young man, I harbored an interest in politics from my acquaintance with political figures like Brooks Hayes, and one important motivation for me to attend law school had been a desire to be involved in state politics. During my law school years, I also drew considerable inspiration from the career of President Franklin Roosevelt. I regarded Roosevelt as a figure of enormous ability who had never let his own physical handicap deter him from pursuing his goals. I began my own modest political career with a race for the state legislature in 1938. Soon after graduating from law school, I had become active in the Pulaski County Young Democrats Club, and the president of that organization, a fine young man from eastern Arkansas named Lee Ward, and several other friends, urged me to enter the race. After many years of dreaming of a life in politics, I did not need much persuasion. In those days, the county used a bizarre system of electing representatives. Instead of campaigning for specific positions, names of all candidates appeared on the ballot in a single list, and the 7 who received the highest number of votes became Pulaski County's representatives in the Arkansas legislature. My name appeared on the ballot along with 32 other hopeful candidates. A law school professor had once told a group of us that since attorneys were prohibited from advertising, a race for the legislature provided a young lawyer with a fine opportunity to meet people and let the public know. After the campaign started, I realized how right the professor had been. I probably should have been called the happy candidate because I thoroughly enjoyed traveling all over the county, shaking hands, passing out campaign cards, and discussing local problems and concerns. By necessity, I conducted an inexpensive campaign. I even had to borrow part of the $75 filing fee. Therefore, I tried to make up for my lack of funding with hard work. I shook hands with potential voters until my own hand became swollen and tender. I talked until hoarseness forced me to relax, and I distributed campaign cards with the slogan "Lucky 13" on the ballot. In an attempt to get voters to remember my name on the lengthy ticket. In rural areas, I stressed my farm background and even ran a small ad in a local farm journal urging the voters to have one farm boy among the 7. All that hard work paid off, almost. Starting with virtually no name recognition, no experience, and little financial support, I finished 8th out of the 33 candidates, 1 place short of election. Of course, I felt disappointed to have come so close to victory, and friends urged I challenge some ballot box shenanigans in North Little Rock. But overall, I regarded my maiden adventure into politics as a success. I refused to contest the election, believing I had laid a positive foundation for my next campaign, and returned to my work optimistic about my political future. 5 years later, I launched my second foray into the political arena. This time I selected municipal government rather than state politics as my goal. At a Lions Club luncheon during the winter of 1943, I sat across the table from Sam Wassell, a member of the Little Rock City Council. Sam informed me that the incumbent alderman in my ward, Edwin Wilson, had decided not to run for re-election and urged me to seek the position. The idea of being associated with city government appealed to me, and after discussing the matter with Bernice and some friends, I decided to try for the post. Since the campaign took place during the war, I did not anticipate a lot of public interest in the council election, and assumed I would be able to conduct a fairly inexpensive campaign. Immediately before the filing deadline, however, Alderman Wilson changed his mind and announced his candidacy for re-election. Suddenly I found myself cast in the role of a newcomer challenging the City Hall establishment. While this situation violated my conservative nature, I decided. A little later, I found particular satisfaction in sticking to my decision when a representative of my opponent offered to reimburse me for all of my expenses if I would withdraw from the race. In those days, I had a Boy Scout civics book view of politics, and this offer only spurred me on to try my hardest to win the council seat. I enjoyed the support of many loyal friends who knocked on doors, telephoned people, and ran transportation pools on election day, and after an enthusiastic campaign, I emerged the winner. Some of the local newspapers hailed my victory as the triumph of a young reformer over the City Hall gang, and I will confess I rather enjoyed my new image. At 33, I became the youngest member of the council, and since I had no obligations to any special group, I eagerly anticipated serving the best interests of all the people in the city. The first issues that occupied my attention on the council were zoning and city planning. The work of J.N. Heiskell, publisher of the Arkansas Gazette, first attracted my attention to these problems. Mr. Heiskell strongly advocated planning the growth of Little Rock for what he anticipated would be a post-war boom. In many of his speeches and editorials, he criticized the work of the city council, which often approved spot zoning, allowing single individuals to violate zoning ordinances. Upon joining the council, I discovered a long-standing feud existed between the aldermen and the city planning commission. Consequently, one of my first goals became to promote a better understanding between the two bodies. To that end, I successfully sponsored an amendment to enlarge the commission by the addition of 3 aldermen. I also proposed that the Planning Commission conduct public hearings on zoning applications before they were presented to the council, not only to educate other aldermen about zoning issues, but also to alleviate the popular notion that city government consisted of deals behind closed doors. My interest in city planning continued after I left the council in 1948 and began serving an 8-year term on the Little Rock Planning Commission. In the midst of my tenure on the commission, we promoted a new series of regulations for developers and established the concept that a certain percentage of newly annexed lands would be reserved for playgrounds. During this same era, the commission members urged the employment of the city's first professional planner and began to coordinate municipal planning with that of the county. This later activity resulted in metro planning, which today enables Pulaski County to avoid much of the unsightly urban sprawl that characterizes so many other growth-oriented cities. Many progressive critics have seen city government as a festering sore of corruption on the body politic. Throughout my years of service on the Little Rock City Council, though, I found that few of my fellow aldermen fit the stereotyped image of a stupid, corrupt official. Most of them were sincere men who tried to serve the people of their ward as best they could. During my 5 years of service on the council, 1943 to 1948, several exciting controversies arose. Probably the most bitter conflict of my tenure involved the city's taxicab franchises. I became aware the cabs were a problem after hearing complaints from several acquaintances of mine who had come to Pulaski County to visit servicemen who were stationed at Camp Robinson outside of North Little Rock. Complaining that the taxi service in the city had become incompetent and inefficient, my friends informed me that the cab drivers often overcharged them. I investigated the matter and discovered that while the city had two franchise companies, Checker Cab and Yellow Cab, one individual controlled both of them. I viewed this monopoly as totally unfair to the public and resolved that if anyone applied for another franchise permit, I would do everything in my power to see that the council approved it. By coincidence, a few months later, a former Arkansan named Frederick R. Andres submitted just such an application. Much to my surprise, the council's transportation committee stalled the application for over a year. Finally, through some intricate political maneuvers, I forced the committee to submit Andres' request to the council. The aldermen approved the new franchise by one vote. Through my investigation, I discovered that while one individual owned both cab companies, he only paid the franchise tax on one and owed the city $5,000 in back privilege taxes. Even though we collected the money under the threat of legal action, our troubles with the taxicabs continued. Mr. Andres started the Dixie Cab Company with 5 cabs and was ready to begin business until he discovered he could not purchase any meters for his vehicles. At first I assumed the situation resulted from wartime shortage. Then I discovered the owner of the other cab companies had used his influence with the meter people to delay and perhaps even sabotage the new enterprise. Acting on my recommendation, the council passed an ordinance providing that the city taxicabs charge only by zones. I knew Washington, D.C. used a similar method with great success, and following a long and bitter council meeting, the city of Little Rock abandoned the meter system and adopted the zone concept, which has remained in force ever since. I was proud of my role in the taxicab conflict and regarded the destruction of the cab monopoly as one of the most positive achievements of the city council during my tenure. While there were other important issues in city government at the time, the conversion from trolley cars to buses, the establishment of one-way streets, and disappointing defeat of a plan for a new airport terminal, and the inauguration of parking meters. The solutions to the cab controversy always symbolized to me city government at its best. Another aspect of my council years that I fondly remember involved my efforts on behalf of the black neighborhood that formed the southern boundary of my ward. Unlike some of my colleagues on the council, I always worked to ensure that the black community in my district received equal services, such as drainage, street repair, and garbage collection. Being handicapped and having experienced discrimination firsthand left me more sensitive to the plight of our black citizens than some of my fellow aldermen. My experience on the Little Rock City Council taught me several valuable lessons, both in regard to human nature and the inner workings of city government. For instance, I learned that special interests can have a corrupting influence on otherwise good and decent people, and that some political figures have little concern for the well-being of their community. I also learned that, despite some advantages, a ward system is not the best form of municipal government. Each alderman has a tendency to be overprotective of his own small constituency and neglect programs designed to help the city as a whole. Consequently, some years after leaving the council, I applauded Little Rock's decision to adopt a city manager form of government. By 1948, I felt I had accomplished everything I could as a member of the council. Although my name appeared in the newspapers as a possible mayoral candidate, and even though I had enjoyed several brief stints as acting mayor, I believed my political future lay in another direction. Believing I could do more for the cause of aiding the blind as a member of the state Senate, in 1950 I announced my candidacy for a Senate seat early in order to become the front runner for the election. I hope to capitalize on my reputation as a reform-minded city councilman and the recognition and favorable publicity I had received for my work with the rehabilitation of the blind. For a while, I enjoyed the unsolicited support of strangers as well as family and friends, and the positive treatment my candidacy received in the newspapers. Then the other candidates announced for the position: State Representatives Max Howell and Bob Riley, and well-known businessman Artie Gregory. The resulting summer degenerated into a typical no-issue, non-ideological local race based strictly on image and perceived popularity, and my own campaign suffered from excessive amateurism and naivete. Refusing to call on wealthy and influential contributors, I only raised around $4,000 to finance my candidacy. I learned quickly that various special interest groups, such as utilities and the education lobby, spent tremendous sums on state Senate races. Howell's campaign was well financed, as was Gregory's. I finished fourth in a close contest. In the ensuing runoff election between Riley and Howell, I supported Riley, but Howell won the race, and for a long time did not forgive me for opposing him. In retrospect, I realized what a tough field of campaigners competed in that 1950 state Senate race. 30 years later, Max Howell is still in the Senate and is regarded as one of the most powerful men in state government. Arkansas voters later elected Bob Riley lieutenant governor, and Artie Gregory served several terms in the state Senate after his election to a newly created position in 1952. During the course of the 1950 campaign, I promised Bernice that if I lost, I would not run for public office again. She never liked the pressure of being in the political arena, the later hours, the fundraising, and the handshaking. I stuck to that promise, although years later I saw several opportunities that interested me. Bernice kindly released me from my promise and told me she would stand by me if I ever wanted to hit the campaign trail again. But I realized I probably never would be a good political candidate. For one thing, my visual handicap prevented me from engaging in the subtleties that successful politicos follow regularly. I could not exchange a friendly wave with people across a crowded room because I could not see them. I used to wear thick eyeglasses, and people assumed they corrected my vision. Sometimes people would tell me, "I saw you in town the other day, and you looked right at me and didn't even speak." You can't high-hat your friends like that, Roy. I also abandoned my political career because I held too many strong convictions. My experience in politics taught me that the most successful vote-getters, especially at the local level, are masters at avoiding controversial issues and tend to have flexible convictions about substantial matters. Though no longer a participant, over the years I maintained a keen interest in Arkansas politics, following the careers of colorful individuals like Brooks Hayes, Orville Faubus, Winthrop Rockefeller, Dale Bumpers, Wilbur Mills, and David Pryor. For the student of Southern politics, I found Arkansas to be a fertile ground for study, though occasionally I still wished the name Roy Kumpe might appear on that list of the state's successful political figures. Although politics always remained an avocation for me, my business career stemmed from the necessity of supporting my family and educating my children while promoting the rehabilitation of the blind. Ironically, I created my food and vending enterprise as a result of my work with the visually handicapped. In searching for ways to raise additional revenue for the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind, I learned of a franchise operation called the Automatic Canteen Company of America, which placed vending machines in business establishments. Ordinarily, the owner or an employee group received a location fee from the machines, but in states like Virginia, the fee went to the Commission for the Blind. I wrote to the company officials hoping to establish a similar service in Arkansas. They politely declined my request and said they regarded Arkansas's economy as being too agricultural in nature to justify the automatic merchandising business. They also informed me that the state had a per-machine tax, which made it virtually impossible for the company to make a profit. I discovered that Arkansas did have such a law, but the legislators had it to tax amusement machines and not merchandise dispensers. Like most Arkansans of that era, I felt confident that more and more industry would locate in our state in the booming post-war period. I also thought that if I could get the per-machine tax altered, there would still be a possibility of using vending machines in places where a concession stand might not generate sufficient income to support a blind person. Consequently, I spoke with State Senator Lee Reeves about changing the tax law. Senator Reeves had begun his career as a teacher at the State School for the Blind, and had always maintained an interest in our work. Through his efforts, a bill revising the per-machine tax passed the Arkansas legislature in 1947. The bill provided that machines dispensing merchandise would be subject to a single vendor's license, regardless of the number of machines in operation. Following the passage of the new law, I contacted the Automatic Canteen Company a second time. In a telephone conversation, the company representative told me he liked the new tax structure and offered me the distributorship for the state. When I told him I wanted the business for the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind, he refused, explaining that the company's experience with non-profit organizations had been poor, and they wanted to restrict their operation to private businesses. Automatic merchandising had initially experienced a difficult time because of an unsavory association with pinball machines and jukeboxes. Many people, therefore, associated machine merchandising with gambling. Also, in the early days of the business, operators tended to rely on cheap and often inferior merchandise. But the Automatic Canteen Company wanted to break new ground. Led by Nathaniel Leverone, Automatic Canteen's founder, the company upgraded its equipment and stocked name-brand merchandise such as Hershey candy products and Wrigley's chewing gum. Leverone maintained high standards and franchised local distributors for a capitalization cost of around $10,000. While disappointed that the AEB would not be able to participate in the business, I also recognized the canteen service as a possible avenue to gain the financial security I needed to remain in rehabilitation work. So after considerable thought, I decided to incorporate a private, family-owned business. Both my father and my father-in-law bought stock in the new company, and Bernice served as treasurer and office manager. We started in 1948 in a small way with a single route man to service the vending machines, but every one of us had great hopes for the future of our tiny enterprise. I founded the canteen business in the aftermath of a great personal tragedy. In the spring of 1946, our 16-month-old daughter, Jerry, died of accidental poisoning. We had an older son, Chad, and later were blessed with a second son, Peter, but our loss left deep scars for many years. While no one ever forgets such a tragedy, I think the new business did provide a healthy outlet in which Bernice and I both could concentrate our energies. Our first machines dispensed candy, chewing gum, and peanuts. A few years later, we added soft drink machines, cigarette machines, and finally even coffee and sandwich machines. Eventually, the business expanded to the point that we opened our own commissary to make sandwiches, salads, and other foods for distribution through our vending outlets. After introducing our first machines in the Cher Norvell Tire Company, we began placing machines in other local businesses. Most businessmen allowed us to install the machines as a service to their customers and employees, and many of them generously donated the location fee to the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind. As I predicted, the industrial area of Little Rock underwent a period of rapid expansion in the early 1950s, and our automatic canteen service benefited from this growth. By installing machines in the new plants of companies like Westinghouse and Alcoa, our company grew to include over 90 employees, including a full-time manager who earned more than I did as the director of the AEB, a fleet of 36 cars and trucks, and our own headquarters building. By the late 1960s, the business annually grossed over $1 million. During the infant years of the company, I always maintained an excellent relationship with our employees. I personally hired almost everyone and knew something about their families and their background. I did not want Arkansas Canteen Service to become an impersonal corporate monster that treated its employees like tiny interchangeable parts in a complex machine. Despite my earlier efforts, however, in 1960, I received a formal notice from the National Labor Relations Board that the Teamsters Union had asked for an election to see if our employees wanted to affiliate with their organization. The fact that the Teamsters would even be interested in a small operation like Arkansas Canteen Service shocked me. After considerable research, I discovered that our recent expansion into the Fort Smith area had barely placed our gross receipts under the jurisdiction of the NLRB and subject to union election. This was the era of Dave Beck, Jimmy Hoffa, and U.S. Senate hearings on labor racketeering, and frankly, I wanted nothing to do with the Teamsters Union. I knew something of the history of the labor movement, the early struggles of the miners and industrial workers of the late 19th century, the Molly Maguires and the Ledlow Massacre, but I strongly believe the Teamsters of the 1960s were another matter altogether, especially when they wanted to unionize a small family business like ours. Almost immediately, my relationship with our employees changed. Many of them hesitated to speak to me. Suddenly, workers I had known for years regarded me with suspicion, and several new employees hired by our manager while I was busy with the rehabilitation center treated me with something close to hostility. The Teamsters won the election by 2 votes and forced me to negotiate a union contract. Throughout these meetings, I noticed the union representative referred to the employees as our boys. Since I had always spoken of them as men, I commented that suddenly our men had become your boys, a statement he did not find amusing. What I did not find amusing was the year-long contract I had to sign with the union. In order to meet their demands, I had to sell the Fort Smith branch, drop any further expansion plans, and in some areas actually reduce our business. As a result, I had to lay off several workers, and the whole situation slowly degenerated into an Orwellian nightmare. At the end of the contract, the employees asked for another election, and to no one's surprise, the union opposed it. After lengthy negotiations through the NLRB, the U.S. District Court forced the Teamsters to call for a vote. As the election approached, I grew fearful we would lose our whole business. Around the same time, a local dairy resisted union organization, and one night someone dynamited the owner's plant, an event that drove me to a diet of Pepto-Bismol for several days. Finally, our employees requested another election, and when the union realized they lacked support, the union leaders withdrew. But the whole experience set the business back several years, and perhaps most importantly, strengthened my resolve to sell the company if an opportunity arose. Of course, other factors entered into the decision to liquidate my holdings. By the mid-1960s, both of our sons had almost completed their education, which had always been one of my main goals in founding the business. Also, the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind had grown to the point that, as executive director, I had to make a choice. There were not enough hours in the day for me to run a private business and continue with my rehabilitation work. Bernice and I had earlier purchased our parents' stock in the company, so in 1967 we sold Arkansas Canteen Service back to the parent company, maintaining our ownership of the headquarters building. My venture into private business played an important role in my life. Each year, Bernice and I traveled to Chicago for a distributors meeting or to another city for a trade association convention, and those excursions became a significant part of our shared experiences. We planned and worked on the business together, sharing its successes and setbacks. The company provided the income for my family that the work for the blind could never have done, and yet the nature of the vending business left me with the necessary time to serve as the director of the AEB and pursue some of my related interests. Since the rehabilitation of the blind remained my primary concern, I became increasingly active during the 1940s and 50s in the American Association of Workers for the Blind. The AAWB grew out of the late 19th century Congress for the Blind, a group founded to promote higher education for the visually handicapped. In 1905, the organization changed its name to the American Association of Workers for the Blind and proceeded to represent all people involved in the profession by sponsoring biannual conferences and seminars on different phases of the work for the blind. The leadership of the AAWB defined the organization as an international association which embraces the layman, the physician, and the voluntary worker, and the professional worker, dedicated to improving the social and economic condition of those who have lost their sight and those with low vision. My first personal contact with the AAWB came in 1941, when the organization invited me to present a paper on my experiences in establishing the vending stand program in Arkansas. Accompanied by Finis Davis, the superintendent of the State School for the Blind, I attended the AAWB conference in Indianapolis and made the presentation. The AAWB impressed me as a dedicated group of individuals whose goal, to serve the blind, equaled my own. I also liked the group's lack of exclusiveness. The AAWB opened its membership to anyone interested in the cause, not just for special subgroups of those involved in the work for the blind. Following World War II, the AAWB grew to such an extent that we inaugurated annual meetings. Around that same time, the membership elected me to serve on the board of directors. After a stint as national membership chairman, I served as the first president, and then, in 1951, at the AAWB meeting in Daytona Beach, Florida, the members elected me president of the organization. In my acceptance speech, I challenged our group to actively recruit new, younger, and better educated people to become involved in the work for the blind, and to establish our efforts on a more professional foundation. This challenge stemmed from my overall concern with improving the standards of service offered to the blind people of the nation. One of my activities as president of the AAWB involved an unsuccessful effort to promote a better understanding between our group and the American Association of Instructors for the Blind. At the time, my good friend Finis Davis was the president of the AAIB, and he agreed with me that since the interests and goals of the two organizations were so similar, they should consider holding joint conferences. But the AAIB board would only agree to a simultaneous meeting where the two associations would meet in the same city at the same time, but in different locations. Consequently, at our meeting in Louisville in 1952, we exchanged panel programs with the AAIB, but the members of the two groups never met together. This illogical situation was not rectified until 1981, when the AAWB, under the presidency of Jerry Dunlap, and the Association for the Education of the Visually Handicapped, the new name of the AAIB, under the leadership of Richard Umstead, formed an alliance with a joint headquarters in Washington. The goal of the alliance was, of course, the ultimate merger of the two organizations. Another important issue confronted the AAWB during my term as president: the growing encroachment by federal employee groups on the right to operate vending stands in public buildings which had been guaranteed to blind people by the Randolph-Shepard Act. This struggle was precipitated by groups like the General Services Administration Employees Organization and the Postal Workers Association installing vending machines in buildings where a blind person might have operated a stand. The employee groups received the location fee and used the money to send flowers to sick members or pay for annual picnics or Christmas parties. As the AAWB's new president, I contacted Brooks Hayes, the congressman from my district, who put me in touch with Representative Graham A. Barden of North Carolina, one of the co-sponsors of the Barden-La Follette Act and the chairman of the House Committee of Labor and Education. After I explained the situation and pointed out how these employee groups were violating the spirit, if not always the letter, of the Randolph-Shepard Act, Congressman Barden launched a full-scale investigation of the matter. Following a series of bitter hearings and meetings at which I suffered considerable verbal abuse from representatives of the employees groups, the situation improved. Although we were unable to secure the legislation we originally desired, the installation of the vending machines in federal buildings sharply declined through an uneasy mutual agreement. The controversy continued far beyond the term of my AAWB presidency and remains a continuous struggle. I know this conflict is difficult for the public to understand because of a general sympathy for the blind and an unwillingness to admit that some people might take advantage of the visually handicapped, but the facts in this particular case seem to speak for themselves. Along with my AAWB work, my membership on the President's Committee for the Employment of the Handicapped served as an enjoyable outlet for me during the early years of the Center's development. This committee grew out of a resolution in Congress in 1948, which designated the first week in October as Employ the Handicapped Week. At the same time, Congress created a presidential committee to promote the special week as well as the employment of the handicapped throughout the year. I received an appointment by President Truman on the committee in 1949 as a representative of the organizations for the blind. Under the leadership of Chairman Ross McIntyre, President Roosevelt's private physician and executive director, William McCahill, our committee promoted seminars and conferences, and by the 1980s, our annual spring meeting attracted over 1,500 people. A journalist by profession, Cahill had been a Marine in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and following the war dedicated his life to the service of others. He had a marvelous ability to promote our cause, contacting television and movie screenwriters to encourage them to present the handicapped in a positive way whenever possible. McCahill also had our committee sponsor essay contests for high school students and promote the Handicapped Person of the Year award. With his creative guidance, the President's Committee became an important force in improving the lives of millions of disabled individuals. Our conferences are always held at the Washington Hilton and have gradually become a trade fair with exhibits sponsored by the manufacturers of aids and appliances for all types of handicapped people. In recent years, the committee's main contribution has been the promotion of legislation to remove as many of the physical barriers in public buildings and elsewhere that for years have hindered the mobility of those confined to wheelchairs. I remember Eleanor Roosevelt addressing our group one year and telling us of the difficulties her husband faced when he began his first campaign for governor of New York. She told us of the numerous times he had to be piped through a window in order to address a group in a second-story hall or auditorium. Through the committee's barrier removal campaign, in the future, perhaps campaigning will not be so arduous for other handicapped candidates. Although overall I am an ardent supporter of removing these barriers, I must confess that as an advocate for the blind, I'm not pleased with some of the recent changes. For example, even though removing a section of curb at each corner makes wheelchair travel considerably easier, a blind person walking with the aid of a cane no longer has an indication he has reached a street corner. I only hope city planners will make some provisions, such as moving the ramps off to the side a bit to offset this potential safety hazard. Years before the President's Committee attacked the problem of barriers, I participated in a memorable occasion involving President Dwight Eisenhower. In 1953, the President entertained a group of AAWB leaders in the Oval Office. After a brief discussion, Eisenhower invited all of us to the Rose Garden for a picture-taking session. In an effort to publicize our new rehabilitation center, I presented the President with a small ashtray containing a picture of our facility. He kept looking at the back of the ashtray while the photographers snapped their pictures, which puzzled me until I saw the photographs. I realized what a considerate thing the President had done by keeping the name and picture of the center in front of the camera. President Eisenhower strongly supported the President's Committee for the Employment of the Handicapped, endorsing our motto, "It's ability that counts, not disability." He put all of us at ease at that session in the Rose Garden, and at one point said, "Well, I just admire what all of you are doing so much. Keep up the good work." I felt so relaxed around Eisenhower, I instinctively patted the President on the shoulder and replied, "We are so proud of the job you are doing for the country, Mr. President." The next morning, the Washington Post ran a brief article on the front page that said, "If President Eisenhower had any doubts that he is doing a good job, he has now been reassured by Roy Kumpe of Little Rock, Arkansas." Those were wonderful and busy years for me, along with my forays into politics, the canteen business, and my work with the AAWB and the President's Committee. I remained actively involved in the Lions Club and taught an adult Sunday school class. But while all of these activities were important, in retrospect, they all seemed to have been peripheral concerns. After 1947, the central focus of my life's work became the Adjustment Center in Little Rock. Even then, I realized the center offered the best opportunity to take my dreams and turn them into realities.